we know today as AT&T. Cyrus McCormick started his reaper business, which was a machine to harvest wheat in the Midwest. John Deere, you may have seen a John Deere tractor somewhere. John Deere started with the steel plow. This is very much a low-tech type of thing. You know what a plow is? It goes through the fields and digs up the dirt so farmers can plant. In the Midwest, we had wooden plows, and they broke a lot because the dirt is very compact in the upper Midwest, and the grass was real thick, so there was roots. It had never been dug up, so farmers were breaking their wood plows all the time. And he was fooling around. I think he was a welder originally, or a blacksmith. I guess we didn't have welders in blacksmith. So he was playing around. He had a little farm, and he said, "Wonder if I use some steel and attach it to a plow." And he played with it, and eventually he got one that worked. So I think in 1837, we have John Deere selling his plow and making a fortune, because now farmers could plow without having to stop and either replace their plow or just stop for the day. So another kind of a low-tech, we would look at that today and say that's low-tech. But if you were a farmer, that saved you a lot of time and money and made your job a whole lot easier. So we credit John Deere with having invented something that opened up the whole upper Midwest. Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, all those states where, which is now called our breadbasket, where we harvest most of our wheat and corn and different grains up there. So John Deere was another entrepreneur, and of course you've seen the green tractors out there, I'm sure, if you drive through the farmland any. And I guess they're into construction equipment too. So all of those things started big companies, and that changed the way we live. Because now, instead of working for yourself on the farm, or maybe having a little shop, a general store, half of you might work in a factory. And those factories began to build in big cities: Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New York City had a lot of factories. People moved into big cities more and more. So we started to move from small town to big city. And this movement from the rural areas of the country into big cities would grow and grow, and it's still going on today. But it started at this time, and it started because, really, you could almost say that right there. Because that was where the power was coming. We were building factories, and that was a big change, because most people had to get used to this idea that they were working in a big factory, and at that time a big factory might be 500 people. You know, we have some today that probably have 2,000 people working there, but at that time a big one would be 500, and that was probably very unusual. Just a few places were that big. And the big difference was, now we began to lose our rural roots, and we didn't know our neighbors as much, and we changed. Immigrants moved into big cities. There were no laws protecting you. If you got hurt on the job, tough luck, you didn't get paid. There's no workers' comp. Half the time there weren't any hospitals, there weren't very many doctors, and the doctors that we had didn't know what to do. You all probably know more than the doctor of 1850. There were no medicines, virtually no medicines. There was no penicillin. There were no painkillers. During the Civil War, more people died, more men died from wounds and disease than they did from being shot at. And they frequently died because they would come in, and the surgeon, they'd strap them down on a bed and they'd chop off their arm, saw it off. We didn't have ether or any kind of anything to knock you out, so I'd give you a little swig of whiskey, give you something to chew on, and hope that you didn't bite your tongue off screaming while they, they try to do as fast as they could, but they've already done 50 that day. So it was pretty gruesome, and that's the way it was in the factory. Factories were pretty hard places to work. They weren't safe. We didn't have anybody going around with a safety committee. There was, that just, nobody thought of it. It was just, who's next? You got your leg cut off? Okay, you're next. You got the next job. If you want to come back, figure out how to walk around here and we might hire you to do something. But it was a whole different way of life, and it took a little getting used to for people. Now out of that began to come the early unions trying to organize, but they were not, did not have a lot of success. It would be many years before unions began to come along to try to help workers. How long have I got?
About 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
If you want to cut it, it's up to you. Whatever you want.
Well, let me kind of wrap it up then with that. And, I guess let me wrap up with just talking a little bit about your life in America in 1850. You really probably had moved into a city. A middle-class family in 1850 had a wife, a husband, typically 3 or 4 kids. If you were middle class, the wife may not work, probably did not work. She was probably involved with a church group. There were many groups trying to cut out drinking, so we had temperance groups popping up all over the place. There were many church groups trying to help immigrants who had just moved in, and they were trying to teach them English, trying to establish places for them to take care of their kids, set up schools that they could go to. So they were very involved in the community trying to help people get ahead. The father probably owned a business, or might have been an attorney, or worked in a factory as maybe an accountant, or one of the managers there, supervisor. If you were a little below that, if your husband worked in the plant somewhere, you barely made it day to day. Some people were successful and did, as anything, I guess, people made it, but it was a fairly tough life. You probably worked. You may have taken in sewing for somebody. You might clean somebody's house 2 or 3 days a week. Pretty much everybody went to church on Sunday. Most everybody worked 6 days a week. It was a 6-day-a-week society. If you worked in a factory, you probably worked at least 10 hours a day. And if you were a businessman, you probably worked 10 hours a day on Monday through Friday, and then at least till noon on Saturday. So there was not a lot of extra time. People did not take vacations. They typically did not take long-term trips. Pretty much all you did was work. And that even continued long into the 30s. And I remember my grandfather telling me during the Depression that he was a salesman and he had a job, but if he took a vacation, he had to hire somebody and pay them out of his pocket to do his job. So it really cost him to take a vacation. So a lot of people didn't do that. And it was much that way at that time. If you didn't come to work, there was no vacation. There was no sick leave. It was a much harder way of life. And I guess it was the beginning of urbanization and the idea that we were beginning to have to think about different ways of doing business. But at that time, you were on your own. So you got sick, tough luck. You took care of it. You didn't have health insurance. You didn't have a hospital to go to for the most part. And if you did, it might not be so good. Sometimes they were not so good. So my point about all that is that people were changing from they had been very self-reliant, living on the farms and then their small towns. Suddenly you go into this big, faceless, big city, and you don't know anybody. The houses are very small, and you're right next to each other. Sometimes if you were especially in New York City or St. Louis, Chicago, you had 4 or 5 story, what we call tenements. They were apartments, very small. Frequently there would be 2 families living in a room this size. So people did that so they could save money. The bathroom was outside. We didn't have indoor bathrooms. There was no shower. There was no bathtub. So it was just such a completely different way of life than living on the farm, where you grew your crops, you knew what you were gonna eat. Most people had a cow, a pig, chickens, so they always knew where they were gonna eat. When you moved into the city, some people tried to have a vegetable garden and have some animals, but most people didn't have that ability, so. I guess I will leave it at that, and any questions?